me the segue that I wanted, which is to go back now, turn the tables on you a little bit to talk about your life and the things that shaped you. And clearly your relationship with Lyndon Johnson, your involvement first in the Peace Corps under the Kennedy administration, but more importantly then the role you assumed in the White House. Some people say that you were really the behind-the-scenes architect of the Great Society, that you were chairing all the task forces that ended up developing the legislation that made the Great Society possible.
Well, as is the case with television, I'm the front man, I'm the man on camera, but there's a whole team beyond me, and that was true with the Johnson administration. I was there by circumstance. I'd never intended to do what I was doing there, and yes, I was assigned by him really in the way that you hand a glass off to somebody who's passing by when you're at a party, and they take it to the table. I was handed the job of orchestrating the Great Society legislation, the civil rights legislation, the environmental legislation, beautification of nature, all of that. But it was nothing I was prepared for. It came by happenstance. In fact, so much of life, as you know, Juan, is serendipitous. That's why you better be prepared at any time for anything, because it may happen to you. And I was for 24 months, 36 months, sort of Lyndon Johnson's right-hand facilitator. I was not I was not a thinker. I was a doer. I was the man who got things done for him. He used to say, "I want the wisdom of gray hairs and the energy of young hairs," and that's what he got from me. But we became very close for the first third of his administration.
How did you know him? How did he end up choosing you?
In 1954, when I was at North Texas State College in Texas, I sat down one Saturday afternoon and wrote a letter to a man I'd never met named Lyndon Johnson, who was the senior senator from Texas and recently elected the Senate Democratic leader in the Senate. And I wanted to be a journalist. And I'd worked on a newspaper since I was 16 and decided I wanted to be a political journalist. So I wrote him a letter, a presumptuous letter, the kind of letter he later said to me he would have written at that age. I was 19. And I said, I can teach you something about young people in Texas if you can teach me something about politics. So the letter got to his job. To this day, if you want to get my attention, write a letter, because that's the way you got Lyndon Johnson's attention. If you wrote a letter, he always said a letter told you more about yourself. He told him more about who you really were, the nature of composition, what the choice of words, and anything. That's where you reach me today. So the letter came to his desk. He gave me a job. I went up thinking I was going to revolutionize democracy, save the nation, redeem the republic. Got there at 4 o'clock on a Braniff airline, went to Capitol Hill, met him. He took me down into the basement, a long corridor to a room shaped like a shoebox, and he said, "I want you to address all these letters." And there were 256,000 envelopes and letters to be addressed on a sewing machine like robo type, where you'd hit the treadle and a metal plate would fall in the envelope. I worked from 7:30 that night until 7:30 the next morning. And you know what he was trying to say to me? Politics is about spit and stamps and envelopes and doing this kind of work. So we bonded. He brought me over to his correspondent outside of his office. I wrote all of his letters to Eisenhower and others, and I was just turned 20 that summer, and we bonded. I went off, went to graduate school, got my Master in Divinity, got a call one day I was going to do my PhD, and it was Lyndon Johnson, Majority Leader Johnson. "I'm going to run for the president. Don't think I'll make it, but I need a right hand. I need a facilitator." So I went to work for him. He didn't get the nomination, became vice president. We ran on the ticket with John F. Kennedy, and I knew that I wanted to go to the Peace Corps. When John F. Kennedy stood in that winter day, January 1961, asked not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country, I said, I want to go to the Peace Corps. I finagled my way to the Peace Corps, became an organizer of it, became its first deputy director, and was doing that happily. When John F. Kennedy called me one day and said, "I'm going to Texas to raise money, and I want you to go down, and I've got some advanced men who've messed things up. They don't know Texas. You know Texas. Go down there." And I was in Dallas, in Texas, on the day of the assassination. Came back with LBJ, stayed with him for 3.5 years. I mean, who would have planned that? Who would have scripted that? Who would have made that happen? It just all came from serendipitous events.
And of course, the great success of the enormous impact of the Great Society was then almost cut short by Vietnam. And you were there as Johnson is grappling with the escalation of the war, and you become one of the doves in the White House. Talk about that and how he was dealing with it, how you were dealing with the fact that you were coming into great contradiction with the policy of your president.
Well, I wish I could say I'd been a moral hero and blew the whistle, but one of my great regrets is that I didn't see soon enough the futility of the war. My portfolio, the first 24 months, was domestic policy, the campaign of '64, the environment, civil rights, and all of that. I had little to do with foreign policy until he made me, against my will, his press secretary, and then he made sure I saw everything he saw. And it crept us upon us. You know, this is a recurring cycle in American life. One of the greatest progressive presidents we've ever had, Woodrow Wilson, 1914 to 1916, was accomplishing so much for working people, for others in our society, and all of it. And then he went to war. He took us to war in Europe. Franklin Roosevelt, Dr. New Deal, became Dr. Win the War. Harry Truman was really as progressive in some respects as Woodrow Wilson, more progressive in some respects than Franklin Roosevelt. Korea. After Truman's legislative progressive agenda was beginning to be enacted, Korea. Lyndon Johnson, the Great Society, the environment, civil rights, and all of that, Vietnam. He was a conflicted man. I've never seen a human being more conflicted than as he escalated the war, knowing, as you can tell from the tapes, which you can listen to on the lbjlibrary.org, the tapes, he was sundered, torn by this decision, and yet he kept doing it. Presidents are afraid to lose wars. They're afraid to be outflanked on the right by the militarists. They don't want to be seen as soft on either communism or soft on terrorism or whatever. So presidents are constantly tugged away from their domestic commitments to foreign policy.
Bill Moyers, you gave a speech recently for the 40th anniversary of Common Cause, and you were doing a tribute to the founder, to John Gardner. And you there talked about John Gardner. I think he was the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. Republican,
brought down by Kennedy first to start public broadcasting, and then became, under Johnson, Secretary of HEW.
And you talk about him going to meet with Johnson when he finally quits over the war.
And he says, Mr. President, I can't oppose you publicly, but I can't support what I don't believe in and what is siphoning off everything we care about domestically, and I can't go into campaign for your re-election in 1968 feeling the way I do about your inability to lead the country while you're taking us to war. And he quit.
What about you? You making that split with Johnson? When did you do it? How long did it take?
I left the White House in January of 1967, which was almost 2 years before his term was up. And there were many factors, one of which is that I had been working on the Great Society, the domestic legislation, and all of our budget, most of our budget, all of his energy, all of our time was slowly beginning to be consumed by the Moloch, by the war, by the flames of war and the budgets of war and all of that. I was exhausted also. I arrived there on the night of the assassination and hadn't stopped. I had 3 small children whom I was seeing very little of. I was exhausted, actually, burned out, as you might say, and dispirited, because I could see us being, as I say, consumed by the ravenous demands of war. The thing about war is that once it's triggered, it is unyielding in its appetite. And the more it consumes and gorges, the more it wants. And I just saw that happening. And I'd lost my influence, frankly. I had been an advocate of stopping the bombing in North Vietnam so that I would arrive late to cabinet meetings or staff meetings, and President Johnson, with whom I still had great affection, would say, "Here comes ban the bomb bill." And as a result of that, my counsel on other issues, my influence on other issues was diminished. And came the late fall of early 1967, I decided that I should leave. I had a great opportunity. The owner of Newsday, one of the largest suburban papers in the country, whom I did not know, he'd only seen me on television. Be careful how you look and sound on television. One called me up and said, "I want you to come be publisher of this newspaper." I said no the first time, and then after my brother's death, he worked with me in the White House, and he died in October of 1966. I was really washed up. And I called him back and said, "I'll do it." So I came to New York and published a newspaper.
I want to ask you a great story that's in All the President's Men that Woodward and Bernstein talk about. Ben Bradley of the Washington Post telling them in the midst of their Watergate investigation a story about Bill Moyers. That he says, one day Bill Moyers told me that that Johnson was going to get rid of J. Edgar Hoover, finally remove him from office and replace him, and I run a front page story. The next day, and then the following day, Johnson holds a press conference announcing that he is reappointing J. Edgar Hoover for life. And as soon as the press conference is over, he says to Bill Moyers, "Get Bradley on the phone and tell him expletive you."
Yeah,
true story.
You never knew what game Lyndon Johnson was playing. Sometimes it was a very serious game in which he had a very important strategic purpose to be gained by manipulation. Sometimes it was just being his petty self. Lyndon Johnson was 13 of the most magnanimous, 13 of the most interesting people I've ever met in one human personality. He could be magnanimous one day and petty the next. He was the best dancer in the White House since George Washington. Women loved to dance with Lyndon Johnson, but he could also at times be uncouth and clumsy and stubborn, and he could do the virtuous thing and he could do the vile thing, and all in the course of a 24-hour period. Very difficult to work for. Ourselves magnified, right? We're all capable, as Whitman said, of great contradictions. Lyndon Johnson was capable of great contradictions. I don't know to this day, Juan, whether he put me to that or whether he really did intend to fire. He was afraid of J. Edgar Hoover. Every president was afraid of J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover either could threaten or could imply that he could bring you down. And there were moments, I know, when Lyndon Johnson felt that J. Edgar Hoover was a yoke around his neck. And there were other moments when I know he realized that yoke ran to Hoover's hand and he could be jerked down. So I don't know to this day whether he intended to appoint J. Edgar Hoover for life and really to screw the Washington Post and Ben Bradley, or whether he changed his mind overnight. Once he had all set up the naming of an ambassador to India, and it leaked. Philip Potter, the Baltimore Sun, somehow at the State Department found the name of the person who was going to be named ambassador. Lyndon Johnson canceled that appointment for 6 months. He finally came back and sent the poor guy, who had been in limbo for 6 months, to India. You never knew what his motives were.